Today, we're going to tackle a really pivotal chapter in American history, the 19th century push to expand westward. It's a story we often hear about in terms of progress and settlement, but at its heart, it's also a story about a series of broken promises that didn't just reshape a continent, they shattered entire nations. So, to really get a handle on what happened, you first have to understand the core belief that drove everything, and that was manifest destiny. This was this incredibly powerful idea that the United States was, well, destined, even divinely ordained, to expand and spread across all of North America. It's so important to see this not just as some government policy, but as this deeply felt conviction that, for many people, made the aggressive push west seem totally justified. All right, so here's how we're going to walk through this history. We'll start with the ideology of manifest destiny itself. Then we'll dive into the whole era of broken treaties, which leads right into the brutal policy of forced removal that we know as the Trail of Tears. After that, we'll look at the reservation system and the conflict that created, and we'll finish up with the devastating policy of assimilation, which really tried to erase tribal cultures completely. Okay, first up, manifest destiny's shadow. This single idea, this belief, it gave the moral and political cover for nearly 100 years of displacement. It literally redrew the map of the continent. And this wasn't random at all. It was a really systematic legal process. It kicks off with the Louisiana Purchase, which creates this huge pressure for land. And that pressure gets channeled through a series of federal laws. First came the forced removal, then confining people to reservations, and finally a direct shot at erasing their whole communal way of life. So, before there was outright removal, the U.S. government's main tool was the treaty. And on the surface, right, it looked like diplomacy between sovereign nations. But it quickly became a history of promises made and almost immediately promises ignored. I mean, if you just looked at the paperwork, it looked like real diplomacy. The U.S. government signed hundreds of these formal treaties. And here's the key thing. These documents officially recognize the tribes as distinct, sovereign nations that were capable of making legally binding agreements. But the ink was barely dry on a lot of these treaties before they were violated. You had this relentless demand for farmland, the discovery of gold. The sheer number of settlers moving west created this overwhelming pressure to just ignore the agreements. Promises of protected land and rights were broken again and again, all in the name of expansion. And pretty soon, this pattern of broken promises wasn't just informal anymore. It hardened into official federal law. It went from quiet violations to a brutal legal policy of forced relocation. The big turning point here was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This was pushed hard by President Andrew Jackson, and it gave the federal government the legal authority to forcibly remove tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral homes in the Southeast to a designated territory way out west. The scale of this is just staggering to think about. Over the course of about a decade, more than 60,000 people from the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations were just uprooted and forced to march hundreds and hundreds of miles, all under military guard. And the human cost, it was just devastating. The journey itself became known as the Trail of Tears, and for good reason. It was horrific. Thousands of people died from disease, from starvation, from exposure to the elements. Just for the Cherokee Nation alone, estimates say at least 4,000 people died. That is a catastrophic loss. This sentiment from a Cherokee leader at the time, it just speaks volumes, doesn't it? It's this mix of profound grief and powerlessness, but also this incredibly unbroken spirit in the face of absolute tragedy. Okay, so after those mass removals, the U.S. government's strategy shifted again. The goal wasn't just to move Native nations anymore. Now it was about confining them, containing them in specific, isolated territories. This new phase was made official by the Indian Appropriations Act. The whole idea was to create this reservation system. Tribes would be settled on these smaller, very clearly defined parcels of land, and in exchange for giving up millions of acres of their ancestral territory, they were promised government protection, food, and other supplies. But the reality was a complete and total betrayal of those promises. The food and supplies they were promised, often lost to starvation and rampant corruption. The protection they were promised, replaced with military massacres. And that tribal sovereignty they were promised, it just vanished under absolute federal control and more land seizures. So this environment of broken promises and just pure desperation, It fueled decades of violent conflict that we now call the Indian Wars. It was a time marked by absolutely horrific massacres like Sand Creek and Wounded Knee, where U.S. troops killed hundreds of non-combatants. But it also saw moments of fierce resistance and even major victories for tribal warriors, like at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. All right, so by the late 19th century, U.S. policy takes one last devastating turn. The new goal wasn't just to control Native peoples anymore. It was to completely dismantle their tribal structures and force them to assimilate into white American society. And the main weapon for this new policy was the Dawes Act. Its target was the very foundation of tribal life, the idea of communal land ownership. The act broke up the reservations, land that was held collectively by the whole tribe, and divided it into small, private plots for individual families. And any land that was left over, it was just declared surplus and sold off to white settlers. And the result of this? It was another absolutely catastrophic loss of land. In just a few decades, tribes lost another 90 million acres. Just think about that for a second. Nearly 2/3 of the land they had left after all the removals and treaties was now gone. It was just a devastating final blow to both their sovereignty and their ability to survive economically. So, to kind of sum up this entire era, the drive for westward expansion, which was fueled by manifest destiny and then carried out through all these laws and military actions, it took an almost unimaginable toll. For hundreds of native nations, it meant a tragic loss of life, the seizure of nearly all of their homelands, and a profound, shattering disruption of their cultural heritage. So you see, the question this leaves us with isn't just about the past. The events of the 19th century have a direct and lasting legacy on the present, and acknowledging this painful history of broken promises, well, that's really the essential first step in understanding the ongoing pursuit of justice and reconciliation that's still happening today.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really helps us.